Same one. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we can settle down so that we start. As you can see, we are already behind time. Yes, once again, welcome to everyone to plenary session 6. It's a panel on gender and pandemic experiences. I would like to start by thanking Codestria for putting this panel together and having this session because it is very important. Gender is still is a very important issue. And as scholars, it's important to integrate gender perspectives in our research, in our work, and for policymakers to integrate, to ensure that their gender perspectives, they consider gender in policy making, in policy implementation. Because all too often, the assumption is now that, well, after many years of speaking and addressing gender in our countries, it's no longer an issue. But you know what? If you look at the statistics, you look at studies that have been done by organizations such as the African Union, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa with their Africa Gender Index. You look at UNDP's work on the Gender Inequality Index, you realize actually that gender is still an issue. Gender inequality in Africa is still an issue. And it has its serious implications if we're thinking about transformative development, realization of the human rights of women and men and all other groups in society. So we are considering gender because it is so central, particularly now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's massive evidence already from a variety of studies that have been carried out so far. For instance, by ILO, most of these studies were in 2020, 2021, ILO, UNDP, World Health Organization, UN Women in 2020. And these studies actually show that in Africa, even though, the COVID-19 pandemic affected literally everybody, all classes, all groups of people in some way or the other, it had a disproportionate impact on women in particular and girls for a variety of reasons, but not only just as women, as a homogeneous group. Within the category of women, you have women living in poverty, women who are in the high income group, the elderly, the younger women, girls. You have rural women, urban women. They were affected in different ways because of their location. But most importantly, the reason why there was a disproportionate impact is largely attributed to, as feminist perspectives would argue, that it is because of the unequal power relations between women and men and within the category of women, within the category of men, that explain these differences in impact. And these have largely to do with cultural norms, social norms, religious practices, beliefs, which have shaped a gender system where there's a hierarchy, where women are subordinate to men in many ways at the household level, in the community, within the public sector, private sector. This ideology of patriarchy has actually shaped the division of labor, which disadvantages women in many ways. So this is why it's important to look into the gender issue. How were women affected within the household? The presentations this morning, even the immediate session before us and yesterday, highlighted, for example, how women within the household, because of lockdown, restrictions in movement, were affected through gender-based violence, mostly women and girls. And then also the burden of unpaid care work, with lockdowns, restrictions in movement, school closures, people working from home, responsibilities in the household increase. But because of the gender division of labor, which is such that women do most of the care and domestic work, they end up doing more, and is also just adding more to their responsibilities and their burdens, and reducing the time available for leisure or for them to take advantage of education opportunities and so on. You look at the exclusion of women from leadership and decision-making. The pre-existing gender inequalities come to play as well, because during the COVID pandemic, actually, there are a number of studies, for instance, by UNDP, which show that in most national and even global task forces to curb the spread of the pandemic, women were grossly underrepresented in many countries. And it had implications in terms of resource allocation. We saw how in the health sector, women's access to sexual and reproductive health actually decreased because resources were shifted towards fighting the pandemic. It sounds logical, but fighting the pandemic should not come at the expense of one group of people. It simply reflects the fact that our health systems are inadequate. And this is an issue to look into. I'm not going to go on and on because we have a panel of scholars. We have done research, field research, and they're going to present to us what they have. We have, on the panel, Josephine Ahikire, from Makerere University. She's going to be the discussant for this session. And the panelists, the first one will be Toyin Ajao from Imole of Africa, eAfrica. And the title of her presentation is going to be Healing Justice, Solidarity, a Feminist Republic, Collective Care Approach in a Pandemic. The second presenter will be Elizabeth Ndaisaba from the University of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. The title of her presentation, and I'm going to read the English version. Pardon me, I should really be ashamed of myself. You can't dare to, the French. Okay. The title of her presentation is The Hidden Face of Gender Inequalities Revealed by COVID-19 Pandemic Crisis in Africa. Then the third presenter is Ode Barros Varela from Cabo Verde. The title of her presentation is Rabide, I don't know whether it's Rabidentes or Rabidente, Women and the Informal Economy in Cabo Verde in the context of the pandemic and crisis era, Academic Activism for an Inclusive Economic Governance. Last but not least, we have Sandra Batasara from Marondera University of Agricultural Sciences and Technology in Zimbabwe. Title of her presentation is Intersectional Analysis of Women's Experiences of Gender-Based Violence in COVID-19 context in Zimbabwe. So over to you, Toyin. Each presenter you have 15 minutes. And after that, there will be I'll give the chance to the discussants for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, our able chair. I'll do my best to keep to time. Awesome greetings, everyone. Nice and happy to be with you this afternoon. I'm waiting for the slide. Which one is the person to move it? So I know what I'm doing. Okay, Basir. Okay, yeah, thank you. So my presentation, as you can see, I want to, sorry, it's me that's supposed to be moving in. Oh yeah. Healing Justice, Solidarity, a Feminist Republic's Collective Care Approach in a Pandemic. I'll speak to why solidarity, but first, I would like to talk about what I'll be focusing on in this presentation. I'll be focusing on 4 things. First, we'll be talking about the Feminist Republic, how they came to existence. I will also be talking about what Healing Justice Framework means in the context of the feminist republic, or why healing justice to begin with. I'll also be talking about the feminist republic, pandemic and post-pandemic interventions, and I'll be ending with my takeaway of what their interventions are about. So, to begin with, the pre-pandemic collective care envisioning of what became the feminist republic started with the Urgent Action Fund Africa brainstorming convening in 2018. What brought that up was the need to address the major intersectional challenges that African women's human rights defenders were facing through a holistic approach as a form of new subjectivity towards social change, like as Professor Amina Mama advocated for in Beyond the Mask, Race, Gender, and Subjectivity. The second very important reason was looking at how to respond to the inadequacies of mental health care by state, as well as how to challenge the mainstream view that made Western models of healing the most viable option for psychological well-being. And this they want to do using the Ubuntu paradigm that Professor Sylvia Tamale in Decolonization and Afrofeminism says we should envision as I am because you are, and not I think so I am. And the other thing that they were considering as at the time was how to intentionally engage Afrocentric tools and strategies to decolonize well-being and transform legacies of trauma. So with that in mind, yeah, I need to remember. Okay, so if you can spot me somewhere there, I was at the convening. So with that in mind, the convening led to the birthing of a collective dream. And that led to the launching of the African Women's Human Rights Defenders platform known as the Feminist Republic. Sorry, I have to keep up with that. Known as the Feminist Republic. And the mission of the Feminist Republic is to prioritize and protect African women's human rights defenders' holistic well-being, as well as to produce feminist epistemological knowledge that is rooted in the Afrocentric healing justice framework. I will take a moment to, so this was this image was from the first convening of the Feminist Republic when they came into existence in 2019. They had their first festival and the launching. So I'm just proud to see some of my feminist heroes at the events. So with that in mind, I would love to situate now what healing justice framework means and how the Feminist Republic is engaging it. I've decided to start this with two important quotations, and you will see why they're important. So Solomon Nawakesi says, there is no question that the lives of women's human rights defenders are under threat. Ill health, insomnia, anger, depression, and burnout are not a new phenomenon. What is new is that self-care, awareness, and healing justice have become more visible, and we are bold about it. What is new is the intentionality with which we approach awareness as individuals and collectives. And Erica Woodland in Healing Justice Lineages, the Dreaming at the Crossroads of Liberation, Collective Care, and Safety, says healing justice emerged in response to the physical, emotional, psychic, environmental, and spiritual crises experienced by many movement leaders and organizations. Burnout, mental and physical health crisis, surviving interpersonal, state, and community violence highlight the need to include health and healing practitioners in our organizing strategies as another major issue. Another major issue our movement struggle with is the ways through which trauma moves within our interpersonal and political relationships. So the book I had mentioned is the actual book that puts together what healing justice framework is all about. And I will quickly mention a few points that came out of the book and what they saw and envisioned healing justice as. So Healing Justice had originated from BIPOC activities, activists in Southern USA as a response to the injustices that they faced during Ukraine's Katrina and Rita in 2005. And their conceptualization was looking at how to make healing justice that has been in existence from their ancestral practices a political and spiritual strategy that can help them intentionally navigate historical and complex trauma that arise from intergenerational oppression and structural violence. The other is they see that it's very strategic and important for them to utilize ancestral technologies and knowledge. I recall that yesterday, some of us were already looking at what the role of indigenous knowledge and wisdom is going forward in our organizing system change and how we envision change in Africa generally. So the idea as well is to root this in intersectional understanding of solidarity within the feminist movement and organizing. This is how the African women's human rights defenders entered the scene, looking at how to use healing justice framework as a feminist epistemological importance in their organizing, in their activities, and in the way they generate knowledge. So, going forward, with this understanding that the existence of feminist republic, knowing fully well the work they are doing is focusing on the well-being of the African women's human rights defenders. When COVID-19 hit, they rose to the uncertainties by looking at how to support the well-being, especially what they call the collective care of the African feminists. And this led to them inviting healers and healing practitioners into that space. This is how I got to curate a particular program for them. And we started during COVID-19 lockdowns, where I designed Ubuntu gatherings, a 6 weeks virtual event that ran from May to June 2020. An average of 40 African feminists from all over Africa were in attendance. What that platform did for them is to get introduced to holistic healing tools and strategies that they can use in their collective healing and self-care. The platform that I created, Ubuntu Gatherings, through iAfrica, looked at how we can utilize holistic tools like music, dance, and Ubuntu healing gathering to kind of give support that is necessary, particularly looking at the importance of storytelling for well-being. Within that space was the thing that was experienced by the African women's human rights defenders in terms of being exposed to practical, unconventional healing modalities, and that offers them cathartic rejuvenation, healing laughter, and non-judgmental empathy. After the 6 weeks event, a magazine came out from the Feminist Republic where they were reflecting on what actually happened within that space and what it meant to the African women's human rights defenders. I have 2 quotations up, but I'm going to read one. FM says, "I am a huge champion of spaces where African feminists can come together and be their full vulnerable selves. So I joined the Ubuntu gathering as often as I could because I enjoyed the honest reflection that was encouraged. I found it refreshing, especially at a time when so many webinars require for us to show off our expertise. There was also a great mix of tears and laughter, writing and dancing, stillness and movement. What's not to like?" So that's just to give you an idea of what that space meant during the lockdown for many African women's human rights defenders navigating uncertainties during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the thing I took away from the feedback of the participants is that that space allows us to begin to undo the inherited disconnection from our ancient or indigenous healing knowledge and practices in Africa that have been eroded by colonialism. Another is that space allows us to embody holistic healing together in a safe space, in a safe and interdependent space, where healing practitioners and healers as well are part of the healing process that is taking place. So the solidarity within that space for me is something I coined to demonstrate the soulful collaboration, collective empathy, and Ubuntu stances that we had during the pandemic. And as such, iAfrica has continued to expand what this means in the practice and research that we've continued to do, and the nexus within that space. There were other activities that continued after the Ubuntu gatherings. They had African root healing as well as other activities. Part of what the Feminist Republic did was disbursing COVID-19 crisis grants as well to African feminist organizations over 7 countries to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, as well as cater to their well-being. Some of the people that got the grants actually even extended these healing activities to their community and the people they serve. I will quickly go through the post-pandemic solidarity. I hope I'm still in time, Chair. So the post-pandemic solidarity of the African feminist, the Feminist Republic continued way after the lockdown. They began rethinking more on what to do with Ubuntu gathering, and they realized that it's important to continue it online so that it can reach many African women's human rights defenders. So they call the platform that is running to date Ubuntu Healing Gatherings. They've also continued to offer the annual Healing Festival, and they bring arrays of practices from different healers, feminist healers across Africa, who are really trained in indigenous practices for healing as well. If you go on YouTube, they just released a video of the second feminist festival. They call it the Feminist Republic Second Festival. You can see how they summarize what took place in that space. So they are envisioning something long-term, and this is leading to the establishment of the Feminist Republic Healing Farm, where Urgent Action Fund Africa secured 13 acres of land in Kenya for a center they call Restoration Center for the Well-being of African Women's Human Rights Defenders. Lastly, there was a healing justice research that they carried out in conjunction with IDS University of Sussex. What they had in mind was how to envision healing justice to speak to the context of the people in Africa, especially African women's human rights defenders and the community they serve. What does that mean? So it can help guide the activities going on. So it won't be a rubber stamping thing that was copied from anywhere else, because BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of colors have similar realities as well as diverse realities. So what are the takeaways for me with this organizing and with my engagement within that space? One is this space allows for us to reinvent the wheel of ancient healing knowledge and wisdom as a game-changing opportunity to rethink and advance well-being and collective care cultures in Africa. And I think this is very important, even as scholars, for us to begin to think of how this can be something of a nexus between research and praxis in our own work and in our own lives. The second is the advancement of healing justice and praxis as an Afrofeminist epistemological knowledge production. And the last one is the way this space continues to champion the institutionalization of healing justice and collective care culture in Africa. Because with the existence of the Feminist Republic and an organization like iAfrica, we are saying that this is a possibility for us to heal long-term, bring holistic care into our system change envisioning, bring that into the space of woundedness that we needed to transform long-term. as well as remembering that our knowledge that is indigenous, that is ancient, is very important in rethinking that change, that well-being that we want long-term, and to do it in a space of collectivity and bringing Ubuntu paradigm into mind when we do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that lucid presentation. Now, Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Bon après-midi. Bon après-midi à tout le monde. Moi, c'est Ndaïsaba Elisabeth. Je prépare une thèse à l'université Thomas Sankara de Ouagadougou, au Burkina Faso. Ma présentation porte sur oui. Ma présentation porte sur la face cachée des inégalités femmes-hommes dévoilées par la crise de la pandémie de COVID-19. Okay. Malgré les progrès constatés en matière de l'égalité femmes-hommes, on déplore la persistance des disparités de sexe qui continuent de sévir la vie des femmes et les inégalités dont les femmes africaines sont victimes dans l'exercice de leurs droits sont profondément ancrées dans la tradition, l'histoire et la culture, y compris les attitudes religieuses. Il s'agit des inégalités découlant de diverses discriminations envers les femmes, et tolérées et acceptées par la société africaine, incrustées dans des normes juridiques, socio-culturelles et religieuses. Et ces inégalités ont engendré d'autres formes d'inégalités d'ordre socio-économique et politique qui se manifestent à travers la discrimination des filles et des femmes en matière d'éducation, de succession et de représentativité dans différentes instances de prise de décision et de gouvernance. Et en Afrique, le marché du travail, En Afrique, le marché du travail favorise de manière générale les hommes, ce qui incite les parents à privilégier la scolarisation des garçons qui ont plus de chances de trouver un emploi. Les filles étant reléguées aux tâches domestiques, cela n'est pas sans conséquence. En effet, ces discriminations font que les femmes et les filles gagnent généralement moins que les hommes et occupent des emplois souvent précaires et vivent près du seuil de la pauvreté. Et lorsque des conjonctures économiques difficiles surviennent, comme ceux de la COVID-19, les femmes et les filles en subissent les conséquences plus que les hommes. Et à ce propos, nous pouvons, comment dire, il y a l'article au niveau du préambule de la Convention sur l'élimination de toutes les formes de discrimination sur la Convention sur l'élimination de toutes les formes à l'égard des femmes, et qui stipule que la discrimination à l'encontre des femmes viole les principes de l'égalité, des droits et du respect de la dignité humaine. Elle entrave la participation des femmes dans les mêmes conditions que les hommes au développement de leur pays. C'est un obstacle à l'accroissement du bien-être de la société et de la famille. Elle empêche les femmes de servir leur pays et l'humanité dans toute la mesure de leurs possibilités. Et néanmoins, la femme a besoin de participer au développement de son pays, de son continent, et au même titre que l'homme. Et c'est pour cette raison qu'il est indiqué également que la discrimination à l'encontre des femmes viole les principes de l'égalité des droits et du respect de la dignité humaine. Elle entrave la participation des femmes dans les mêmes conditions que les hommes au développement de leur pays. C'est un obstacle à l'accroissement du bien-être de la société et de la famille, et elle empêche les femmes de servir leur pays et l'humanité tout entière dans toute la mesure de leurs possibilités. C'est dans ces conditions de discrimination qu'a surgi la pandémie de COVID-19. Donc, la participation des femmes au développement économique et social, l'égalité des chances et la pleine participation sur un pied d'égalité des femmes et des hommes en tant qu'agents et bénéficiaires d'un développement durable, en tant qu'agents sur un pied d'égalité des femmes et des hommes, en tant qu'agents et bénéficiaires d'un développement durable, sont des conditions essentielles à l'élimination de la pauvreté au moyen d'une croissance économique soutenue et du développement social et de la justice sociale. De ce point de vue, on ne saurait dissocier le développement de l'Afrique à celle de la pleine participation de la femme africaine à son développement. C'est la raison pour laquelle le respect des droits de la femme africaine, qui laisse à désirer, devrait être une réalité en tout lieu et en tout temps, en toutes circonstances. Pour cela, 3 interrogations ont été soulevées au cours de notre travail. Nous avons la première interrogation qui est principale, c'est pourquoi la pandémie de COVID-19 a-t-elle affecté d'une manière disproportionnée la vie socio-économique des femmes en Afrique? Est-ce que le degré de protection actuel des droits socio-économiques des femmes en Afrique permet-il aux femmes de faire face aux crises pandémiques comme celle de COVID-19? Que faire pour renforcer leur résilience socio-économique en période de pandémie? L'étude s'articule autour de 3 axes de réflexion. Et en premier lieu, l'étude vise à rechercher et analyser l'essence des inégalités femmes-hommes en vue de découvrir leurs causes profondes. En deuxième lieu, l'étude essaie d'examiner les corrélations se trouvant entre ces inégalités et la situation socio-économique des femmes en période de COVID-19. Troisièmement, troisième axe de réflexion, nous analysons la consistance des mécanismes de protection des droits socio-économiques des femmes afin de pouvoir proposer des réformes nécessaires sous forme de solutions pratiques et durables. Nous allons passer au premier point. Les inégalités entre les femmes et les hommes en Afrique proviennent de diverses sources. Elles sont le produit, comme avons mentionné tout haut, elles sont le produit de différents facteurs. Et nous avons retenu deux types de facteurs au niveau de cette étude. Il y a d'abord les normes juridiques, donc les discriminations qui découlent des normes juridiques et les discriminations qui découlent du statut socio-économique, socio-culturel de la femme. Donc, concernant les inégalités découlant des normes juridiques discriminatoires, il y a au niveau de certains pays, au niveau des ordres juridiques de certains pays, et on peut constater des textes juridiques, des textes normatifs qui ont maintenu des normes discriminatoires, par exemple, au niveau de la nationalité, au niveau de la propriété foncière, au niveau des, comment dire, de la succession. Il y a dans certains ordres juridiques comment dire, les lois sur le statut familial. Donc, il y a des lois qui ont maintenu, ou bien des textes juridiques qui ont maintenu des normes discriminatoires. Donc, la femme ne bénéficie pas de la même protection que l'homme. Et les normes juridiques discriminatoires constituent une source importante des inégalités femmes-hommes en Afrique, ce qui est en contradiction avec les textes normatifs du droit international général. Et donc, il y a au niveau, à l'article 2 de la Convention internationale sur l'élimination des discriminations à l'égard des femmes, et stipule que le principe de l'égalité entre l'homme et la femme, et donc il y a le principe d'égalité entre les sexes, donc, indique que le principe d'égalité entre les sexes inclut l'interdiction de toute discrimination et l'adoption de mesures spécifiques pour l'avancement des droits des femmes. Cela rejoint l'article 2 du protocole de Maputo, qui indique que les États doivent combattre la discrimination à l'égard des femmes sous toutes ses formes en adoptant les mesures appropriées au plan législatif, institutionnel et autres. Malgré ces consécrations au niveau des textes internationaux ou continentaux, il y a toujours la persistance des discriminations, des normes discriminatoires juridiques. Que dire des normes juridiques au niveau des ordres juridiques de certains États africains discriminant les femmes, notamment en matière de propriété, de nationalité, d'héritage ou de succession? Le statut socio-culturel, c'est un deuxième point que nous allons aborder comme source de discrimination, source d'inégalité. Il y a le statut socio-culturel de la femme qui se conçoit d'abord dans la famille. C'est là où les enfants acquièrent leur identité déterminant ce qui est socialement acceptable pour les femmes et pour les hommes. C'est pourquoi les enfants intègrent leur rôle social au moyen des leçons apprises et des éventuelles corrections en observant et en imitant, bien sûr, leurs parents et et autres femmes et les hommes de la parenté qui leur servent de modèle. C'est de cette même manière que les stéréotypes à l'égard de la femme se perpétuent de génération en génération et se dessinent par là le statut socio-culturel de la femme qui est une source considérable de disparités femmes-hommes en matière de développement. les attitudes traditionnelles faisant de la femme un objet de soumission ou assignant un rôle stéréotypé perpétuent l'usage répandu de la violence et de la contrainte à l'égard de la femme. C'est le cas de mutilations génitales féminines, des mariages précoces et autres préjugés ou souffrances d'ordre physique, et mental ou sexuel, ainsi que la menace de tels actes. Et nous allons aborder la face cachée telle que appréhendée au cours de cette étude, la face cachée de ces inégalités femmes-hommes. La pandémie de COVID-19 a révélé que les femmes et les hommes n'avaient pas les mêmes moyens, les mêmes capacités pour faire face aux effets de la pandémie. Et ces femmes ont été touchées d'une manière différente par les effets de la crise. Et cela a été dû aux inégalités qui étaient préexistantes à cause de ces discriminations que nous avons abordées. Et la face cachée dont on parle au cours de cette étude, c'est les inégalités femmes-hommes dévoilées au cours de la pandémie de COVID-19 sont le produit d'autres inégalités entretenues par certaines normes et traditions africaines discriminant les femmes. Donc, les normes juridiques et les normes socio-culturelles, comme nous venons de le montrer, c'est ce que nous avons et c'est ce que l'on pourrait entendre par face cachée abordé au cours de cette étude. C'est dans cette situation de fragilité socio-économique observée chez les femmes africaines qu'a surgi la pandémie de COVID-19 et puis les femmes se sont retrouvées avec des moyens sociaux, culturels moins solides et inégaux par rapport à ceux des hommes. La portée de cette face cachée les femmes, en effet, les femmes occupent souvent des emplois précaires comme les petits commerces et le commerce transfrontalier et l'hôtellerie. Et en fait, c'est à cause de cette discrimination, à cause de ces inégalités qui étaient préexistantes, qui poussent les femmes à occuper des emplois qui ne sont pas, qui ne sont pas très rémunérateurs. Et puis, les femmes se sont retrouvées avec des moyens socio-économiques précaires, des moyens financiers précaires par rapport aux hommes. Et puis, les femmes n'ont pas pu faire face aux effets de la pandémie au même titre que les hommes. Donc, nous pouvons alors, le corollaire de ces discriminations, ce sont les difficultés d'adaptabilité, les difficultés d'adaptation que les femmes ont eues au cours de la pandémie. Et puis, ces difficultés se sont manifestées de deux façons. Tout d'abord, au niveau de la résilience, les femmes n'ont pas pu résister aux effets de la pandémie comme les hommes ont pu résister parce qu'elles avaient déjà des moyens précaires, des moyens socio-économiques précaires. Elles étaient déjà reléguées au rang inférieur. Elles avaient des moyens précaires et n'ont pas pu résister aux effets de la pandémie, surtout sur le plan financier. Et puis, au niveau du relèvement aussi post-COVID, les femmes.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm sorry I have to stop you, but let's appreciate your presentation. I do hope, though, that during the question and answer session, you can say a little bit more and whatever you did not have a chance to cover. But thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. The next presenter is Ode Barros Varela from University of Cabo Verde.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for your presence. I came from Cabo Verde. My native language is Cabo Verdean, but the official language is Portuguese, and I was speaking English. Hoje pour parler français, si vous voulez.
In 15 minutes, eh?
Okay. As you can see, this work was made with the collaboration with Tatiana Reis, is a feminist historian from State University of Maranhão, Brazil. Is a Black feminist historian from Brazil. I began to study informal economies since 2008, and she began to study the Rabidantes woman since 2011, I believe. I'm a political science. I came from international relations, political science, and a little bit of political economy. So in my research, I realized that the issue of gender cross practically all the research in fields in social science. And the field of informal economy is the main example of that. That's why the collaboration was obvious with Tatiana. And that's why my objective, sorry, you can see the meaning of Rabidantes in this slide. That's why my research in the field of governance, I came from the School of Governance, Business and Governance in my university. My research is around governance, the idea of that we have collisions of forms of governance, indigenous form and excellent form that came from abroad, that impel us to see. As you can see, I came from a big country, you know, from West Africa, a very big country, Cape Verde. You can see in the map. And Tatiana Reis research about women who go to Brazil to shop informal trades, then came to Cape Verde. That's why our encounter was in this Atlantic Ocean. No, as you can see, my main purpose in the beginning was the study of panorama of the struggle around governance in Cape Verde. Okay, particularly the informal economies, so-called informal economies that challenge Cape Verdean state. Because my idea is to question the official economy, the science of economy, the knowledge of science economy, and to see the informal economy as not this knowledge, not a simple conceptual reproduction of reality, objective data, but as authentic constitution and or foundation of the reality, centered on the subjects. I will skip some slides because time is running out, but the general objective, or we can say a research question, is if the Rabidance woman will be not only alternative actors to the exclusive dominant neoliberal capitalist economy, but also protagonists of a social and or solidary economy. My interrogation, methodologic speaking, and also theoretical speaking, if it is possible to see the weight of informal economy, to study this not a way to transcend the field of official economy, but also to widening the spectrum of economic field itself, allowing the visibility and emergency of alternative economies, and decrease of what I can call is the concept that I work on, is the econo-diversity. The need for its legitimization also implies the obligation to recognize the existence of analytical tools and diverse epistemological horizons in order to fight to combat what I call the economicide, the dead or other forms of economies, the alternative economies. Of course, the research was conducted a long time ago, between since 2009 until 2019. In 2020 and 2021, it was difficult because of the lockdown. But mostly the research was made in this biggest island of Santiago. You can see is the island is look like big one, no? Unfortunately, we didn't have time to go to other islands. Since we are in the special General Assembly dedicated to Tandic and Kandawir, I can say that he was one of us inspired to in the critical African political economy, and also Mustafa, in the idea that we have the task, this African political science, to bring social transformation back to agenda in Africa. But also, the work is based on some feminist critical analysis of authors like Amina Mama, Hakima Habas, Lynn Osom, and other ones that have you can say a little controversial idea about the role of the informal traders, habitantes. They consider that they represent a poverty trap for women, concentrating them in low-skill, low-income activities with a little prospect of advancement. On the other side, economists have tended to see the informal economy as a source of economic opportunity for women in the sphere free of the gender bias regulation of the formal economy. Also, we have a sociological approach. Namely, we have one of our center that says we have intimate civil society, strength civil society, and civil to civil society. We don't have time to talk a little bit, but the other one is John Galton with the concept of the structural and cultural violence and structural peace. The idea is that the economic infrastructure were created in a sexist way that prevent women from participating in the official economic space and the public space in general. So therefore, that the current situation, in the case of the first one that I referred, the political economy, in Kandawir argue, for example, that neoliberalism cries out for the market, but does not seem to know how to deal with really existing capitalism on the African continent, as the state is distanced from local capitalists who operate to a larger extent within formal economies. So it's important to see that this kind of hegemonic way to see the economy leads to the state to lose all its capacity as an agent of economic and social transformation. About these three concepts, only I can say to you is the empirical research effectively demonstrate that habitantes, the women inhabitants, are on the border between the servile society and the uncivil civil society. And successive economic crises and the negative consequence of the pandemic have reinforced this condition and the scenario of a great social vulnerability. As you know, the social security, the subvention of the state was not attributed to the informal traders and other informal activities. They didn't fulfill the lockdown. The lockdown, they say, was for the formal people, right? For the state workers, but not for the informal workers. Not only the habitantes women, but also to artists and etc. and other professions, mostly in the tourism and service sectors in Cape Verde. So we have some studies in informal economy and Rabirante women in Cape Verde, but from local authors, there are practically none. I believe this is the first one. We have Marcia Grassi and Tatiana Reis, my colleague from Brazil, and another author from Brazil, Venâncio Vinicius. And Marcia Grassi was the first one to criticize, the sense of economics for treating informal economy as a disease, a malfunction of the systems and a non-productive sector, and not considering its protagonists, the Rabirantes, as entrepreneurs, and looking at how African societies are able to accept and integrate the values, behavior, and practice of modernity, and have their own dynamics capable of responding to challenge from abroad. We have is not a homogeneous group, is a complex group. Mostly we're trying to divide them in three groups, with the first one with less purchasing power, the second one is some, and the last one is great purchasing power. My interrogation is to how we consider these agents. They are agents of multi-territorial globalization. Is an expression of the very diffuse model of world development that can and should be evaluated in several dimensions. I tend to disagree with that. For me, they could be agents of a counter-hegemonic globalization. They are in the exclusionary way integrated in the world market and its activities. So more than an example of alternative development or sustainable development, I believe they are alternatives to hegemonic globalization and developmentist discourse. The Rabirante women show us that this pandemic was not the first one. I believe the first big economic pandemic was the so-called structural adjustment plans. So the era of crisis and pandemics and epidemics is unfortunately structural in the continent. So this so-called many times these lost decades was in fact a period of profound social transformation. In Cape Verde, for example, there is an expansion of space of informal economies in response to generalized crisis. Some social groups, network institutions have been diluted, but others have been reconstituted. Some where absent emerged with new vigor, and new groups have emerged. So it's demonstrated that informal economies are essential means for survival for a large section of the population and are not necessarily linked to criminal activities. Okay. And some data for you to know a little bit the reality of Cape Verde. Coming to end of my presentation. The informal sector survey published in 2016 by our Institute of Statistics show that an increase of 46% in the informal activities. And the presence of women is remarkable, around 58.8% against 41.2% of men. And regarding with the informal production units, 62.2% are managed by women and 37.8% by men. Of course, we can find men in the informal trade, but the number is residual. And although women represent 64% of self-employed individuals, 52% of employers are men. So we can see the inequality in the fields. And of course, in terms of wage, women earn less than men. Other data show that in Cape Verde, we have a significant percentage of women. We are a chief of the families, okay? In families headed by women, the unemployment reached 48%. And we can see the complex group, but we can find some factors that contribute to weaker insertion of women in the form of
Okay, maybe
labor maker.
you can
Thank you.
conclude in a minute.
From the low level of literacy caused by school dropped and other factors, patriarchal society, Christianist society, and the Rabitantes are aged between 30 and 60 years, more or less. The factor that I think to you, we can see not only the religious factor, but other factors you can see in this slide. And the way they find to have money to invest in this business are, for example, in the credit, informal credit, we can say Toto Caixa in Cape Verdean. It's not only Cape Verde has this kind of instrument. For example, we can find this in Mozambique, Wichitik. Isabel Casimiro talk about that. My colleague from Guinea-Bissau, Patricia Godinho Gomes, has talked about the Bambaram works. So the women can find a way to finance their activities. And in Cape Verde, we have also other. So what really draw our attention is the capacity of the woman, of the residents, to survive. In the you can see in the paper how women with the low wage capacity began to have big capacity. Okay.
Ode, thank you.
1 minute.
Thank you very, very much for. You
I
can
have a
conclude
last
in
slide.
half a
I can
minute.
conclude. I can conclude. Well, I think this last slide only to see that the what I can say, the academic activisms. What I put the second title from academic activists for inclusive economic governance. The slide is because we believe with our research is possible to maximize the emancipation potential of informal economics and the activities of women. And I can say in Portuguese, obrigado.
To you too. Ode, thank you very much. Again, a very interesting one. Unfortunately, you know, with time, we just have to give highlights of our findings. So last but not least is Sandra Barasara.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. My presentation is on intersectional analysis of women's experiences of gender-based violence in COVID-19 lockdown context, in the context of Zimbabwe. I think since yesterday, we've been talking about disruptions and ruptures and everything else that COVID brought. So I'm a sociologist and also I have a background in anthropology. This is more like a story of what happened in Zimbabwe during the COVID-19 lockdown when it comes to women's experiences. In 2020, with my colleague who is not here, Dr. Manasa Chiweshe, we found ourselves with a grant from the Antipode Foundation, the Right to the Discipline, where we then decided to conduct a study on the geographies of exclusion and vulnerability in urban Harare under COVID-19 from March 2021 to March 2022. That's when we published the working paper. The intention here, or the objective, was to understand the nexus between COVID-19 and gender experiences of gender-based violence, with our main argument to see the relationship between how space and restrictions operate in a gendered way to produce and reproduce differential impact among different categories of women. That's why we used the lens of intersectionality.
And in terms of what we call the geographies of exclusions in the context of Zimbabwe, I'm not going to give detail in terms of the context. My colleague Clement earlier on in the other session talked about, you know, the number of deaths that occurred in Zimbabwe. And one of the statistics there is my mother who died of COVID during that time. So in terms of the geographies of exclusions, in terms of how the lockdown was organized, we had roadblocks, we had curfews from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. We had police arrests, we had raids, we had demolitions of urban informal markets. We also had state-sanctioned violence against different groups. And here state-sanctioned because there were actually, you know, operations that were carried under different ministries together with the police, and also Joint Operation Command, and the increasing militarization and securitization of the public space. In terms of methodology, what we called researching women's experiences in the shadow of the pandemic, it was not easy to get out this research during this time, but we waited until the lockdown measures started to ease in 2021 for us to be able to carry out in-depth interviews with selected women with the help of community health workers, activists, and also be able to undertake small gatherings so as to be able to also adhere to the World Health Organization protocols on COVID-19. So this is one of the challenges that we also faced in terms of how we could capture fully women's experiences during this time. And we focused on two resource-constrained communities or low-income urban communities, with one of them created during the colonial era in 1907, when Zimbabwe was just starting to have settler colonialism starting to consolidate. And in terms of how we defined GBV, we defined it as an act against a person's will, which is grounded in gender norms and asymmetrical power relations. And this can take the form of, you know, sexual abuse, physical, economic, emotional, financial abuse. And this research, why it also was important for us was it was a chance for us to illuminate further on the value of intersectionality theory in terms of unpacking women's experiences, borrowing from Kimberly Crenshaw in terms of looking at intersecting factors that define one's position, and our rejection that, you know, women are a monolithic category. There is a, you know, one phrase that defines women, and also further looking into the works of Patricia Hill Collins, who talks about intersecting oppressions, where we are saying one's identity is also related to other categories such as class, such as race, ethnicity, marital status, age, and in the context of our study, geography or location, in terms of these women being located at the margins of the urban economy, at the margins of urban development, and also within informal spaces in terms of how they are located economically. And also trying to understand that even if this theory did not originate within the African context, it is relevant in terms of understanding oppressions, because they do not occur independently. But these are intertwined, or they are linked, they are related at various levels. So we are talking about multi-layers forms of gender-based violence. So around March 2020, UNICEF was already reporting that children were facing violence within households as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And global rapid assessments were already starting to show that, you know, the situation of women was being compounded by deeply entrenched inequalities that exist, for instance, in African spaces that my earlier colleague from Burkina Faso mentioned, that our societies are already characterized by patriarchal practices and uneven power in social relations that are linked to culture, to traditions, and also to religions. Amnesty International, for instance, in their rapid study in Southern Africa, already mentioned that Southern African homes were turning into enclaves of violence and cruelty and brutality, where women were locked with their abusers. And self-isolation, because it restricted mobility, it means these women were literally trapped at home with men that could abuse them or other, relatives, which affected them in various ways. In Zimbabwe, around March, the first 11 days of the hard lockdown, which started in March and lasted until around August to September, Musasa Project, a women's rights organization, within 11 days, it had recorded 764 cases of violence. And by 30 June, it had recorded 2,768 cases of GBV. And in December, in their report, they had indicated that on average, there had been a 40% increase in gender-based violence since the beginning of the pandemic compared to the pre-lockdown levels. And the most common form of violence was intimate partner violence, especially that was happening within the private domain or at home. And in general, we see also the suspension of human rights frameworks within this context where the state took central control to avert the pandemic, but not taking into consideration how they were producing and reproducing forms of violence and abuse against certain groups, in this case, women. What we called the weaponization of the pandemic by curtailing freedom in different ways, in terms of public assembly, in terms of all those who also relied on what are regarded as mobile livelihoods, especially within the informal sector. So here I then go to look at various groups. The first one is women in the informal sector. My colleague from Cape Verde has already mentioned a lot about women in this sector, but here we see feminized impoverishment coming from economic violence that was unleashed by the state, by the demolition of markets, but also because of the curtailment of movement that women, from these two Mbara and Epworth communities that I mentioned in urban Harare could not access, because mostly they sell in the CBD, but the law was that you are only allowed to move 5-kilometer radius from your place of residence. Beyond that, there was the military, there were the police, and you needed papers for you to be able to move around. And most women in the informal sector didn't possess those documents to be able to move into the CBD. There were roadblocks. So we see here, the deterioration of livelihoods, women being denied their right to economic survival. Children, for instance, in the community of Epworth, were locked down with predatory, relatives who took advantage of them, and a number of cases in terms of rape were also, recorded. This was compounded by the fact that we are talking about low-income urban communities with very constrained living spaces where children, and parents and other relatives live in very small spaces where abuse is prone to take place, and this lack of privacy. We also have another group here, sex workers, who rely on mobile livelihoods. And in this context, we also noticed the resurgence or reemergence of the discourse that we saw during the HIV and AIDS pandemic, sex workers as vectors of diseases. And this was also seen in Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria, where this discourse started to also emerge. And in this regard, they faced violence from the military. They also faced violence from the police. They could not also operate beyond curfew hours. And for them to be able to do this, it's either they bribed the army in form of money, or what Transparency International called sextortion in their study on gender and corruption, where they had to offer sex to the security men or the military for them to be allowed to operate beyond curfew hours. And we are talking about this in a context where sex work is already criminalized and sex workers are stigmatized. And we see hate and violence already in a country with a history of violence and abuse that has been recorded over and over again. Another group that we also see, a group of women, is women with disabilities. In this context, their livelihoods basically came to an abrupt end because the lockdown was, hurried and poorly planned. And in terms of economic violence, these depend mostly on begging on the streets, vending and handouts. And the streets were no-go areas because, they were militarized or securitized, like I said. Some of them were married, depended on their spouses and relatives who had also been pushed out of any kind of work because of the lockdown. Therefore, they fell into abject poverty. UNESCO, in their rapid assessment in the country, mentioned that in 2021, income for women living with disabilities shrank from $43 per month to $13 during the COVID-19 period, whereas the poverty bottom line during this time in the country was 219 for a person of 5. And then we also see young women and girls in terms of their violation of health rights with increases in pregnancy and other harmful cultural practices, for instance, early marriages in Epworth and Mare, which were already sites of harmful cultural practices even before the COVID-19 lockdown. We also see girls getting into, sexual activities, intergenerational sexual activities, because they were now at home, they were out of school, where we suppose that schools perhaps offer safe spaces to these kind of people or to these groups. And the last one is about the violations that are occurred around access to justice. Survivors of gender-based violence were also denied access. For instance, those who experienced rape and other forms of violation could not access justice, is basically because of two aspects. The first one, initially, the work by women's rights groups that helped women were not categorized under essential services initially. And also the lockdown, because it curtailed movement, these women could not access the various spaces because of their social location, and referral pathways were also broken down during this time. So in conclusion, we see that, because of all these intersecting factors that include geographical location, social positionality, and other factors, including what the state was doing, women found themselves in very difficult predicaments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Very interesting findings there. I think the panelists have made their presentations. I think let's give them one round of applause before I invite the discussion. So we now have the discussant, Josephine Ahikire from Makerere University in Uganda. Josephine, you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
And I know you mean it. Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Chair. And I would like to join those who congratulated CODESRIA on the 50 years or half a century of impactful research, networking, publication, training, name it, and making what we would really see as the African intellectual. Godwin in the beginning said he was a child of Codesria. And given that I'm a maternal auntie to Godwin, I'm therefore a maternal auntie to Codesria. And for those who have done deep social history, you know what the maternal line represents. And we can take that maternal line also to think about the gender dimensions of COVID-19. So in a sense, there are many things that happened, and the four presenters have given us, a wide trajectory of the inadequacies, vulnerabilities, the kinds of nestedness in the COVID-19. What we would say really is that COVID-19 found a nest in which then all these things came to sprout. In this, we could also enrich as Africans, as we really talked yesterday, in terms of thinking about what kind of knowledge product, what kind of knowledge agenda should African social scientists take out of COVID-19. There were multiple pandemics. The pandemic of the rich, as has been talked about, in hospitals, on oxygen, ambulances, and so on. The pandemic of the poor, not very restricted, but with other restrictions in terms of accessing healthcare. One of the things was that one asymptomatic, maybe truck driver, would be cared for by 5 health workers, and the one with malaria and maybe complications of pregnancy would have none. Pandemic for the men, pandemic for the women, and of course in this we are always talking about how women are disproportionately misrepresented or suffering. But there was also a pandemic for men that revealed crisis of masculinity, spiking gender-based violence, which is not just about the physical, but the kind of ways in which masculinities and the power that men wield almost turned against them. In one of the social media things, one of the cabinet ministers in Uganda talked to women and said, please stop checking your husband's phones. They are vulnerable. And it was as if the whole world of women was just in a phone. They didn't have anything else, and it was just the phone. The differences in the children, in how they experienced the pandemic, females and males and so on. But for some children, actually, the lockdown was the only opportunity they got to see their parents. So all these things, the multiple lessons and the multiple nestedness, we really need to take it into account. And I think our presenters have been able to do that. I think what we need to do with this information, especially in terms of re-engineering Blackness in the politics of identity, I was just thinking that actually that was an opportunity. Somebody asked, is there an initiative to capture, for example, the healing, alternative practices of healing that in the first presentation in terms of healing justice. Have we actually taken on these lessons to construct new notions of being? In many of the homes and so on, there was particularly demonstrated the power and resilience of women. When people talk about how Africa was resilient in terms of the COVID-19, in terms of its manifestations and its effects, have we actually taken the critical role that women played in that kind of survival? Have we actually asked ourselves, this thing we call economy of care, at some point, it was the only activity that happened in the households, nothing else. Was it an opportunity to actually retheorize the economy of care or care itself and what it stands for in terms of defining relations? In most cases also, we see that we talk about the bad things that happened. Are there missed opportunities that we could actually salvage in terms of how we theorize feminist imperatives on the African continent, or maybe to say it differently, how we theorize African feminism in terms of the roles of men and women? Is there a way we can actually ask different questions that are critical of the neoliberal agenda? I see many papers now by scientists that are saying there's a level of the toxicity in what is called African medical, is it African medicine? That's how it is called. It is not even herbs, but it's traditional African medicine. Is that a resurgence of the dominance of the Western mode of medicalization? Because in a sense, unproved reports say that most people who were admitted in hospitals could have survived if alternative ways of doing things in those hospitals had been adopted. Is that the kind of knowledge that we could interest ourselves in? And in a sense, that would also bring the whole question of indigenous knowledge that is predominantly resident in women's ways of living and doing, in the whole food knowledge systems and so on. Are there lessons that we can learn? And given that, I love the chair because she looks at you and you really know that you need to behave. So, so in a sense, the 4 presentations alert us to more knowledge that we need to create in terms of benefiting from this shock. It's a rude shock, and maybe that is also the time to wage some of these ideological wars that we should have engaged in. So finally, I'm not going to discuss each presentation because I think there's a thread that we pick, and there's a thread that we can then pick to advance our knowledge systems. And our theme for this celebration is about social sciences and pandemics. On the African continent, what lessons? And those lessons definitely will not be taken on by our orientation to capitalism or our kind of knowledge in the marketplace, where even writing a paragraph, somebody needs to be paid. There's a professor who said, you African intellectuals, you want even to be paid to breathe. And that sounded like, at least he was African, so he was really talking about the self and saying what kinds of alternative disposition to knowledge do we have as those with a privilege to move knowledge forward. So our experiences of pandemics, just like wars, enjoining us to feed more fuel to our feminist imperatives in our theory? And if so, how? How will it be that we can actually be able to re-theorize what we have as gender relations? In some cases, when we say traditional Africa, that also can be contested because Africa is diverse, it's a diverse continent. Just as we say women are heterogeneous, even Africa itself is not one single experience. Even cultural systems, religious beliefs, all that is actually very heterogeneous, and it's good that we are also talking about intersectionality. And as I have said also, can we be legitimate to say that care and the care economy at one point became the utmost human activity? Did we pick lessons? On the front of indigenous knowledge systems, these reports, unconfirmed, unwritten reports, can we actually document? Can we write Africa in a new way? Can we actually re-theorize indigenous knowledge? And finally, I picked interest in the issue of women-headed households as one case in terms of how we actually look at our social history, how we theorize our experiences. In many cases, when we talk about a woman-headed household, we are talking about a single woman living alone, sometimes picking a few things from here and there because they are children, so they have been picked somewhere. There's something that was donated, and it's a single adult in that household. What we normally see in records of bureaus of statistics in terms of male-headed household is where there is a male present. And in some cases, in many of those cases, there is also a woman inside there, inside the household. So in this sense, we are comparing a household with one adult and another household with two adults, just because the other one is in the normal mode of a male-headed household, so male household head. But actually, we are comparing two things that are not the same. And when we say, normally women-headed households are suffering and so on, there are so many things and variations that are happening in there, some of which are actually just replicating the ideological system in which males are assumed to be heads of those households. There's an argument about de facto and de jure headship, where men can be resident in a house, but actually are not taking any decisions, and where the females is the de facto head of that household. All those notions have implications on how we understand our social reality and how we put that also to inform policy and inform debates on the continent. And so our African Academy has to take these lessons, re-theorize these experiences, have a politically framed intellectual agenda. I'm happy to have our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Finance and Administration, Professor Henry Naitwe. He's an engineer, but he's always talking social sciences, and I would want to take him to my College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and to say that there is more benefit to speak together than to speak separately. Modern medicine, Western medicine, to actually speak to what is now labeled traditional or ethnomedicine. And the fact that in that sense, then you'll find that some of that research and knowledge agendas will have women as key informants and what we call opinion leaders. Let me leave time for the participants to engage with these questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, Josephine, thank you so much for keeping to your time. Actually, you are even before your time. Shall we give you a one round of applause? Thank you for raising some very pertinent issues. So I'm going to ask each of the respondents, the panelists, to respond before I invite the floor. I know people may be looking at their watches. Remember, this session started very late, not because of the fault of the panelists. We have 2 hours like all other sessions. We are due to stop at, what is it? At 10 to 5. However, I stand to be guided by the organizers if we can cut it short. But I'm sure, you know, from the floor, there are people with questions. So to do justice to this panel, I think we need to give due time. And also, so for now, let me ask the, sorry, I don't, please go ahead. Hey, let me explain myself very clearly. Sorry if I was not. Since the discussant has given us an overview here on thoughts around the presentations, I thought now we need to give opportunity to the panelists very briefly to respond to the issues that she raised. After which, if you may, after which I can invite questions from the floor. No? Okay, okay. If I got it wrong, advise, please. Sorry. Look, I'm flexible. I have no problem. We can take questions so that they respond to the discussant as well as questions from the floor. It was just that I didn't want them to be overloaded with questions or issues. You know, some of them get lost. So that's why I thought they could just respond briefly, then we invite questions from the floor. However, I am flexible, I am reasonable. So I go by, I listen. So now we can ask, I'll invite questions and comments from the floor, and the panelists will take note, after which we can, okay, say something before.
Merci beaucoup, Chair.
Session.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Je m'appelle Marema Touré. J'ai trouvé ce panel extrêmement important et j'avais voulu réagir sur la dernière note de la discutante. La discutante a dit que l'Assemblée générale, c'est sur Covid et les sciences sociales, et elle a appelé la communauté que nous constituons à aller au-delà pour conceptualiser toutes ces nouvelles tendances et les théoriser qui sont en train d'émerger. Je pense que je suis tout à fait d'accord avec elle. Et j'ai cru que dans ce panel, particulièrement, il y avait un début de réponse à la question de la discutante. J'ai beaucoup aimé l'effort de Varela avec son concept d'économie CID, mais je voulais juste lui dire que si la colonialité des savoirs, cette colonialité à laquelle le Codessia s'attaque est possible, c'est parce qu'à la fois, il y a eu l'épistémicide et il y a eu les linguicides. Et c'est le couple épistémicide et linguicide qui a créé et qui perpétue effectivement la colonialité du savoir. Mais je me disais que moi-même, dans mon cas, je parle beaucoup de culturicide. Parce que, pour revenir encore à la discutante, ce qu'elle disait que si on avait valorisé, et cela se dit depuis le début de cette réunion, nos propres savoirs endogènes, peut-être que la réponse à Covid partant de l'Afrique aurait pu être plus articulée. Et c'est pour cela que c'est important que j'insiste sur ce qu'elle dit pour appeler notre communauté à encore plus d'audace. Plus d'audace dans l'autorisation que nous nous disons, dans l'autorisation que nous nous donnons, de dire que nous sommes capables de faire des énoncés sur notre propre situation, et nos énoncés sont plus forts parce que nos énoncés sont plus basés sur notre quotidien. Je veux simplement terminer avec le dernier effort de conceptualisation que j'aime beaucoup sur la violence. Je pense que la définition qu'elle a donnée de la violence, je pense que la définition qu'elle a donnée de l'intersectionnalité et le travail d'analyse qu'elle a fait à partir de cela est extrêmement important. Mais je crois qu'en tant qu'Africains, il y a une autre dimension de la violence qui nous interpelle par rapport à Covid. C'est la violence symbolique. Je crois qu'avec Covid et Ebola, en Afrique, nous avons connu un double bin, c'est-à-dire une situation qu'on n'a jamais connue, parce que l'exigence de Covid était basée sur la transgression de la règle sociale de vivre ensemble en Afrique. Ici, nous vivons ensemble. Si nous avons un malade, nous lui tenons la main, nous l'embrassons, nous l'étreignons. Et la première règle de Covid, c'était de dire fini le vivre ensemble tel que vous le connaissez en Afrique. Et je crois que cela est une dimension de Covid, de la violence symbolique qui a accompagné Covid qui nous interpelle. Je vais finir là pour dire l'enterrement des morts. L'enterrement des morts. Et je crois qu'aujourd'hui encore, en même temps que nous devons faire le deuil de nos morts, en même temps que nous devons le théoriser, le processus de théorisation et de conceptualisation de ce que nous avons vécu doit être notre processus de vivre notre deuil. Je vais m'arrêter là, simplement pour dire que moi, je parle beaucoup de culturicide, je parle même de matriculturicide, parce que le culturicide, l'assassinat, mais il nous faut Varela connaître qui est l'assassin. Si le linguicide a été le fin du colon, si l'épistémicide a été le fin du colon, si les conditions d'émergence de la science sociale en Afrique expliquent cela, aujourd'hui, avec l'économicide, nous devons savoir que l'assassin, il est aussi ici avec nous en Afrique.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. So, okay, I'll proceed to take questions and comments from the floor. Just a few questions, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond. Let me take a few from this side and this side. Okay. And this side, hands. Two hands so far. Sorry, you may sit down. We'll start. Excuse me. First. So please, with due respect, go ahead.
OK,
But-
merci beaucoup.
But I also want to appeal that you are very brief with your questions, to the point, so that we have enough time for them to respond. Otherwise, as you know, we are already behind time, not because we are, by the way, we started late. Please go ahead.
OK, merci beaucoup. Par rapport à vos doléances, il y a la première partie de ma question s'adresse à Madame Elisabeth, celle qui fait une thèse en droit public. Donc, je vais laisser la question et à la pause, on pourra discuter. Sur certaines affirmations, je voudrais tout simplement dire que Sartre a l'habitude de dire que mal nommer les choses, c'est ajouter au malheur du monde. Sur la question du salaire, par exemple, dire par principe que les femmes sont moins payées que les hommes, il va falloir donner des précisions. Parce que quand vous êtes fonctionnaire, la grille salariale, elle est la même pour les femmes et pour l'homme. Donc, il n'y a pas de grille salariale pour la femme, pour qu'on dise qu'a priori, la femme est moins payée que l'homme. Maintenant, est-ce que c'est dans le secteur privé? Oui, là, il va falloir nous donner des précisions. Deuxième chose, en ce qui concerne mon pays, il y a beaucoup d'efforts qui sont faits. Quand vous dites que la jeune fille, les parents préfèrent maintenir la jeune fille à la maison et envoyer le garçon à l'école, ça, c'est des discours qui sont dépassés. Il faut actualiser vos données. Chez moi, par exemple, à moins qu'on ne pense que les femmes qui sont dans l'économie sont marginalisées. Chez moi, au Togo, les femmes sont plus riches que les hommes parce qu'elles sont dans l'économie formelle. Vous avez entendu parler des Nana Benz togolaises, c'est des femmes qui sont très fortunées. Alors, le secteur informel ne concerne pas que les femmes. Il y a beaucoup de jeunes aujourd'hui qui sont dans le secteur informel. Alors, par rapport aux efforts qui sont faits, par exemple, aussi bien au Togo, je ne vais pas parler à la place des Béninois, mais aussi bien au Togo et au Bénin, il y a des lois qui sont votées pour protéger les apprenants dans leurs relations avec les filles, de façon à permettre aux filles d'aller plus à l'école. Au Togo, par exemple, la loi, je vais terminer par là. Au Togo, par exemple, la loi sur les marchés publics, article 17, exige qu'il y a un pourcentage des marchés publics qui soit attribué aux femmes, aux jeunes et aux femmes. Donc, sur la violence faite aux femmes, je voudrais tout simplement... Non, les dernières interventions. Sur la jeunesse faite aux femmes, la violence faite aux femmes pendant la COVID, je voudrais qu'on nous donne des données appréciables, disant que pendant la période avant COVID, il y a eu telle donnée, après COVID, il y a telle donnée, pour qu'on puisse savoir si effectivement il y a de telles situations.
Thank you. Now I'll ask Professor Lenkabula. And Professor, please be very brief. Actually, let's just say one question or comment.
The
Very
gentleman took my part. I would have responded to him, but my name is Puleng Lenkabula. I'm from University of South Africa. I'm truly appreciative of the presentations that were made. I also think it's very important that when we theorize around patriarchal, hierarchical issues, we shouldn't be limited only to quantitative issues. We are totally aware of subversions in the experiences and the violences that majority of women or even their societies experience. My question was about the theorization of drawing on the ideas, feminist scholars from the global north, such as Patricia Hill Collins and others. I'm wondering what would have changed if your work would have interacted with Amina Mama or these professors who are sitting here, who you could have benefited from the Gender Institute from. What could have changed, and how would have that affected your
theorization. Finally,
Thank you, Professor Pleng.
finally, no. I
Didn't
think I
we
need
agree
to
on
make
one question,
But
one
yes,
comment?
finally, I think men at Codestria must attend the Gender Institute. I think the questions that we've been experiencing, it must be compulsory. I think the questions that have been raised when women have been in their theorization, projecting how women are on the underside of patriarchy, of distributions of resources, there's a counter narrative that has been evolving without attendant analysis or substantiation. I've just experienced it today. I think we need to be honest in how we engage as Codestria scholars, because this will hollow out the very progressive work that Codestria had invested in, which actually influenced
Okay.
positively policymaking in our continent.
Thank you very much, Professor Lenkagula. There were, two hands there, the lady and the gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Julius Niringimana from Makerere University, Uganda. And my question goes to Odeya Varela, who talked on political economy, women and informal economy. You seem to argue that women are more successful than men in informal economy. But we are aware that when we are discussing political economy of development, we look at key issues like power, actors, and interests. And so that means that before we understand this, we may not be able to tell exactly whether women are more successful than men in the informal economy, because we need to theoretically and contextually interrogate these issues. I give an example of border informal sector in Uganda, which is dominated by men, not women. It is through this sense that interest articulation comes in. Lastly, but linked to that then, is on whether political economy advocated by Tandika Mukandawira and colleagues reinforced or disintegrated your findings. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la modératrice, pour la parole accordée. Je tiens à féliciter les panélistes pour leur présentation. J'ai une question pour la deuxième intervention. Dans ses propos, elle a dit « La pandémie de COVID-19 a affecté d'une manière excessive la vie socio-économique des femmes en Afrique. » Et j'aimerais savoir, quels sont ces facteurs qui ont affecté ces femmes africaines? Est-ce qu'il y a les données qui prouvent? Si elle peut nous montrer ces données-là. Je vous remercie.
Thank you for your questions and comments. Because of time, I will not be able to take more questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists to respond. Maybe you have 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Please don't exceed that because of time. You know, there were quite a number of comments, and you respond to what you feel, you like to. The other issues, I think, can be discussed outside the session, but it will be good if you can, panelists can respond to the issues raised by the discussant concerning, further theorization around gender and pandemics, and issues around indigenous knowledge, the role of indigenous knowledge in a pandemic and how, it could be integrated, for instance, in the medical field. I think following along the lines of the first presenter, Toyin. So let me give each panelist 2 to 3 minutes to respond, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to respond briefly to what our discussant mentioned, maybe I will just stick to one issue where she asked what we could have missed in terms of our work. One of the things that I've always grappled with was in terms of how the COVID-19 pandemic could perhaps reconfigure, gender roles and relationships, given the fact that men were now at home. I think there's need for, more interrogation and further studies in terms of whether, how intra-household relationships shifted during this time in terms of care work. Because the reports that we have mostly are that, women were overburdened with care work. What were men doing during this time when women were overburdened, yet these were all locked down at home? So it's a potential research frontier that we can theorize. Then I want to respond to what Prof mentioned in terms of theories. Yes, I didn't have time to go into detail, but my analytical lens in terms of intersectionality was also going to be talking about the works of Amina Mama, the works of Yelewe Clark at the Africa Gender Institute, Patricia McFadden, the Zimbabwean feminist scholar, and Zosa Muzi, the Zimbabwean, African-American feminist writer, and other writers. We have also grappled with the notion of intersectionality. But I think we cannot deny, that Kimberly Crenshaw pioneered this, notion of intersectionality, and we appreciate it. And referring to her doesn't mean we are denying our own, theories and theorization and our own uniqueness, as Africans. What could have changed in my analysis, for instance, like you asked, is the engagement with colonialism and neocolonialism as African women. This is something that is missing from Crenshaw's analysis. She doesn't engage with these issues because they also didn't, of course, other theorists go into issues of slavery and so forth, but we have unique experiences. Settler colonialism in Southern Africa, for instance, apartheid in South Africa. This could have, brought out a different analysis in terms of understanding violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the commentaries and questions. First of all, I will respond to the question, the commentary of the Mariama. Merci beaucoup pour le... Je suis totalement d'accord avec vous. Votre recherche sur le culturicide, je pense que c'est fantastique parce que nous sommes sur cette question, parce que l'épistémicide, c'est justement basé sur les concepts d'économicide, pardon. C'est basé sur le concept d'épistémicide, la basis de plusieurs concepts, par exemple dans le domaine des démocraties, les notions de démodiversité, par exemple, etc., etc. Et je suis d'accord parce que les continuités coloniales nous interpellons sur l'objectif de combattre cette continuité coloniale. Je pense que nous pouvons parler un peu sur cela après. now switch to English. I'm sorry. I will speak in French with my friend Mariama. Regarding to the comments of the Professor Moyo, I believe the Professor Moyo, no, sorry, Professor Adikiri, sorry. I believe she tell us to be careful about the statistical data, the quantitative data, when related to analyze, for example, the issue of households, sorry, I believe it is. Yes, and I agree completely with her because, for example, in our country, in Cape Verde, unfortunately, we didn't have time to profound, to talk a little bit more about this question. But there is more than a patriarchal society. Sociologists from the 70s and 80s, the name I believe is Sigrist, who was in Cape Verde. He says, no, this is not a patriarchal society, and even is not a matrilineal society. It's a matrifocal society. I mean, what is matrifocal society? It's the idea of enlarged household. When you seems, the idea is like the man is the head of the household, but in practice is the woman. Or even where the woman is not there, the aunt, the grandmother, etc., as around this matrifocal society. So it's necessary to go behind the statistical data of who is the chief of households. And lastly, but not least, to my Uganda researcher, brother who is talking about the political economy of this question. Of course, unfortunately we didn't have time to talk about this in the presentation. The power relation is, or the material conditions of this woman, and even the global conditions, the political economy, the power relation, the global situation that lead us to this collision, to this confront between the hegemonic economy, the neoliberal capitalist economy, and what I propose to be the respect of other forms of economy that could be more inclusive than the hegemonic one. So in the end, I agree with you, and we can talk a little bit more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ade. I'll ask Elizabeth.
Je voudrais répondre aux questions. La première question qui parle de, qui porte sur, donc celui qui a demandé si les femmes sont moins payées par rapport aux hommes. En fait, ce que nous avons dit, ce sont des conséquences de ce qui s'est passé il y a longtemps, parce que les femmes sont retrouvées dans des situations précaires et à cause de la situation socio-culturelle. Nous avons évoqué de la situation socio-culturelle et des inégalités qui étaient préexistantes, donc avant l'arrivée du Covid. Et au fait, les femmes, ce ne sont pas toutes les femmes, mais en général, il y a des études qui ont été faites au niveau de l'OIT, au niveau d'autres, les études des chercheurs. Il y a un rapport, par exemple, il y a des études, donc je n'ai pas pu trouver tous les documents, mais dans mon texte que j'ai donné, il y a des, comment dire, il y a des effectifs, il y a des données que nous avons données sur ce que nous avons présenté. Il y a, en fait, ce sont les emplois, par exemple, les emplois informels Donc, ce ne sont pas tous les emplois informels. Il y a des femmes qui sont des entrepreneurs, bien sûr, de grands entrepreneurs, mais la plupart des cas, la plupart des femmes, comme l'a soulevé beaucoup d'autres personnes qui m'ont précédé, ont essayé de montrer combien la plupart des femmes africaines ont été obligées de travailler dans des emplois informels, ont été obligées d'occuper des emplois informels, des emplois non payants. Ce n'est pas au niveau, comment dire, c'est vrai que j'aborde le droit, j'aborde la question d'une manière juridique, mais ce que j'ai dit par, comment dire, ce sont des causes profondes. En fait, ce sont des causes profondes, ce sont des causes lointaines qui caractérisent. Ce sont des facteurs lointains qui caractérisent ce qui s'est passé, ce qui a été manifesté au moment du COVID. Donc, cela ne veut pas dire qu'au niveau du droit, il y a une différence, comment dire, de paiement. Comment dire, il y a des lois, je n'ai pas évoqué des lois sur le droit du travail qui sont, comment dire, qui sont discriminatoires, non? J'ai parlé des facteurs, comment dire, j'ai parlé des facteurs lointains, des facteurs qui ont poussé des femmes à occuper cette situation précaire qui a fait que les femmes se sont retrouvées dans une situation socio-économique inférieure par rapport aux hommes. Mais ce ne sont pas toutes les femmes, c'est une catégorie de femmes, mais en général, les femmes sont moins favorisées à cause des différents facteurs que nous connaissons tous, les facteurs culturels, les facteurs traditionnels, comme beaucoup de personnes ont dit. Et concernant les données, il y a un rapport qui a été, comment dire, il y a un rapport de l'OIT sur les statistiques de l'économie informelle, un rapport de 2023. Il y a aussi donc il y a aussi comment dire, un autre rapport qui montre les statistiques aussi des femmes et les hommes. Donc, dans l'économie informelle, c'est un rapport de 2019 qui prouve toujours la différence de moyens, la différence entre les femmes et les hommes sur le plan d'emploi, sur le plan d'emploi. Et ce sont ces emplois qui sont... OK, merci.
That women earn less than men and they are in lower paid occupations. Maybe in your country, the picture could be different, but definitely there is overwhelming evidence. Like she cited ILO, you know, the International Labour Organization does a lot of research globally, and they produce these reports that actually show the gender discrimination and biases within labor markets, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world. Okay, Toyin. Thank you very much.
I hope my mic is working. All right, see. I agree with the discussant when she says we need to envision new theories, and I think that's where healing justice framework is important. And I will explain why, how or why, looking at it from the angle of the question that Professor Puleng raised, that this theorizing doesn't seem to have a lot of African impacts in it. It actually does a lot. The framework was speaking to the healing justice that has existed within the feminist organizing, and many feminist theories and practitioners have spoken to it. Part of the feminist scholars that have engaged within that space is Professor Sylvia Tamale, and I recall that the work of the late Professor Wangari Maathai, especially a work on the challenge for Africa about self-knowledge and self-acknowledgement and reclaiming our own healing mechanisms, kind of featured in how they envision the kind of change that needs to take place. So in a sense, in the book that I've mentioned before, you know, I'm in between navigating the nerves of presentation and having 15 minutes. I didn't really have enough time to dwell on it. With the healing justice lineages, dreaming at the crossroad of liberation, collective care, and safety. Erica Woodland and Kara Page actually spoke extensively to how the healing justice framework was impacted and influenced by the organizing on the continent of Africa. So that intersectionality lens was there from the beginning of their envisioning. I hope I cleared that up a bit. Thank you.
This brings us to the end of this session. Difficult to summarize, and I won't try to, but really, in my view, it raised pertinent issues around gender and the pandemic in the context of Africa. I want to thank the panelists for the rich presentations and the discussant for a sterling job for raising pertinent issues that we as scholars can think about in terms of future research on how Africa can strengthen resilience against any future pandemic, and to do so by also taking into account or considering gender perspectives. That's very critical and important. So the issue around theorization, I think maybe there are unanswered questions. You might have wanted more, but we don't have the time. But for me, I think it's thought-provoking. These are issues that we can continue to reflect on beyond this General Assembly and think about in terms of future research that can enrich our understanding of gender in the context of pandemics. It may not be COVID-19 again, or it may not be COVID, but other pandemics. So, and yesterday, I liked some of the suggestions that were made, the conclusions that Codestria as a research organization needs to be creative, to be innovative, you know, come up with, you know, our own indigenous ways and theorizations, you know, theories that are anchored within our own local context, and solutions that originate from our own thinking. I think that's very important. And so I think the panelists have done a good job. There may be unanswered questions, but that's for future reflection. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the discussant. And thank you very much to all of you for your attention, for the rich comments and suggestions that you have made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you to all the panelists. Colleagues, in the interest of time, we have spoken to the next panel, and there are only 2 panelists present. And so we are requesting that we just have this panel for about an hour before we break for tea. So we can break for tea much earlier, and we can leave much earlier as well. So let's just call to the stage. Thank you very much, Prof, and the panelists. We'll call to the stage